Our speaker this morning really needs no introduction, as he has spoken at the Garden a number of times. I believe this is either the fourth or fifth time at the Garden. Phil Gully, of course, was raised in Danville, Indiana. He's a Quaker pastor who graduated from the Christian Theological Seminary. He's authored over 20 books, including the Harmony series and Porch Talks. Perhaps the greatest impact that Phil has had on the 21st century is his challenging what it is that we tried, the thoughts and ideas we so often put in Jesus's mind. If you've his book, If Grace is True, which he co-authored with James Mulholland, as well as If God is Love, are both books that have changed many of us and have changed our way of thinking and the way that oftentimes we speak on behalf of Jesus. Current books include If the Church Were Christian and The Evolution of Faith, all which call us to constantly be mindful of our love for Christ and how we share that love in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an absolute honor to welcome Phil Gully to the Garden today.
Well, it's good to be here. Good to be here. I asked Carolyn what you were in the midst of, and she said you'd been thinking about stewardship, and said, oh, bring in a ringer for that. That's right. But it put me to thinking about when I was a kid, and there was a man in our town named Cowboy Landon who lived in a shack with his wife a mile south of town on Cartersburg Road. She wore a wedding ring with a big fake diamond on it, and when we were kids, we didn't know the diamond was fake, so just thought they were rich, even though they didn't have electricity or plumbing or even a car. Cowboy rode a bicycle everywhere he went, and to Johnston's IGA every Saturday morning, and carried their groceries home in a pillow sack tied to the handlebars. He was old, Cowboy was, a veteran of the Civil War, my father told me, which I believed for a long time, until I did the math and figured out that he would have had to have been 130 when I knew him, plus or minus a few years. He was old, but not that old, not redwood tree old, just up there. Most everybody in our town, every family had a car and a job and a television set and went on vacation in July at Indiana Beach, and every Friday after Thanksgiving would drive to Indianapolis to see the world's tallest Christmas tree. One continuous strand of light bulbs stretched back and forth, up and down 52 times from the ground to the top of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, 242 feet in the air, 4,784 light bulbs, which came on all at once when the mayor of Indianapolis, standing at the base of the tree next to the statue of the Union soldier, flipped a switch. I first saw it in 1971 when Richard Lugar was the mayor and gave a speech, the mayor did, about how lucky we were to live in Indiana, where people didn't settle for some rinky-dink little Christmas tree, but instead had the world's largest Christmas tree. Then he would pause and let that salient fact sink in and flip that switch, and nothing happened. Not one light came on. This was back in the old days, you'll remember, when one burnout Christmas bulb caused all the bulbs in that strand to go dark. So they had to test each bulb, which took a while, and after a few hours, most everyone had left, even Mayor Lugar, except for us, because my father did not believe in giving up. He said, you watch, they'll find it before long, and everyone will be sorry they left. I stood there in the cold, thinking of Cowboy Landon and how lucky he was not to have electricity. The statue of the Union soldier looked like Cowboy Landon, which I pointed out to my father, who said, well, maybe they based it on him. It's very possible. And then he told me about when he was in World War II. serving as an aide-de-camp to General Eisenhower, which I believed until I did the math and realized my father would have only been 8 years old. Cowboy Landon had been away to war, to World War I, it turns out, which left him shell-shocked and unable to do anything except ride his bicycle to Johnston's IGA every Saturday morning, where Orville and Esther Johnston, who belonged to the Quaker meeting there in our town, would fill his pillowcase with food. Peanut butter and bread and canned vegetables and macaroni and cheese and ice cream, so Cowboy would hurry home and eat it before it melted and not stop at the Buckhorn Bar on the way home. That had been Orville's idea, the ice cream, because he had mistakenly assumed that Cowboy's economic difficulties were the result of alcohol. Post-traumatic stress disorder not widely known about in those days. Besides, people had said, Dick Hoban had been in World War I, and he came back just fine, so it couldn't have been the war that made Cowboy the way he was, even though Dick Hoban had spent the entire war at Fort Dix, New Jersey, in charge of boot distribution, sizes 8 through 10, which he pointed out upon his return were the most common sizes. And there were some days he was so exhausted he could barely stand it. And all these years later still had flashbacks of bunions and blisters and hammer toes, though he didn't want to talk about it. Orville and Esther Johnson were the richest people in our town, which we knew because Orville wore white shoes, the only man in our town to own a pair of white shoes. And they drove a 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado to Florida the first 2 weeks of February, leaving Gibby Hockett, the produce manager, in charge of the store. Gibby had been in World War II, and those first 2 weeks of February were his Omaha Beach. Orville and Esther were scarcely past the town limits when Gibby would have the stock boys standing at attention in front of the banana bin. Suck in that gut, wipe that smile off your face, tuck in that shirt, polish those shoes. You kids today, you don't know the meaning of work. God help us. If the Russians ever attack, we'd all be dead by supper. Now get up there and sack those groceries. Cans on the bottom, eggs on top. Don't forget. Gibby spent his off hours at the Buckhorn Bar, drinking off the stress of his job. Wilted lettuce, potatoes with soft spots, bruised bananas, wrinkled grapes, not to mention the grape samplers. Thieves, all of them, people who belonged to the Quaker meeting and taught Sunday school and wouldn't be caught dead saying a cuss word, but felt perfectly free to eat grapes without paying for them. It drove Gibby crazy. He wrote an editorial about it for the newspaper, naming names, and got called into the office the next Monday, where Orville almost fired him and would have, except that Gibby was Esther's brother. So Orville gave him a week off instead, just to get him out of his hair. They went to Indiana Beach to the amusement park, Gibby and his wife and their 3 daughters, the oldest of whom, Rachel, worked at the IGA as a checkout girl. It was Rachel who went on a date with the man running the Ferris wheel at Indiana Beach and returned home and was, as they say in the Bible, found to be with child. 9 months later, she gave birth to a little carny boy who came out of the womb sporting a tattoo smoking a Marlboro. It was amazing. Amazing. He had no sooner cleared the uterus than he was lighting up. She named him Ferris so he wouldn't forget his father, even though the father was nowhere to be found. Now, this was back in the olden days, back when unmarried girls who found themselves with child went to stay with out-of-state relatives, except that all of Gibby's relatives lived in our town, and none of them were all that anxious to take Rachel in. So Gibby sent Rachel to live with Cowboy Landon and his wife in their little shack out on Cartersburg Road, a mile south of town, thinking no one would know about it, though everyone did within 12 hours, and all the parents across town were warning their children, don't let that happen to you. You don't want to end up living with the Landons, and if you don't think I'll send you there, you have another think coming. Just striking terror in adolescent hearts across our town. Cowboy Landon and his wife had never had children, never had. They'd wanted them. Something was wrong with one of them, though. They never knew. And then all of a sudden, in their advanced years, they found themselves with a family, a sort of daughter and an impressionable infant in their home. So an example of industry had to be set. You know how that is. Once you have children, you have to set an example. So Cowboy Landon put on his best clothes and rode his bicycle into town and asked Raleigh Baker for a job at Baker's funeral home, picking up dead bodies, which he had done during the war. He knew all about it. The principles of leverage and lifting, and where to grab and when to close the eyes and not look. He applied for his driver's license and had a phone put in his shack so Raleigh could call him if need be to go pick up bodies. And so he would. All around our town and throughout the county, heart attacks and tractor and corn picker accidents and car wrecks and drownings, and once a murder, the only murder in our town ever. A man choked to death by his wife, the mother of his 7 children, after he came home from work one day and asked her, "So what is it you do all day? I think maybe you ought to get a job instead of just sitting around here doing nothing." And so she choked him, which was really the only option she had at the moment. And her lawyer, Beezy Gibbs, loaded the jury with mothers, and she was sentenced to time served and granted a pardon by the governor. Maybe you remember reading about that. But even back then, as cheap as it was to live, you could not get by just picking up dead bodies for the funeral home. So Rachel, who had quit her job at the IGA because everyone in town thought her pregnancy was their business and would ask her about it, went to work as a typist for Beezy Gibbs, the lawyer. 3 days a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Cowboy's wife watched Ferris, who was getting over his rough start and becoming something of a prodigy. He had stopped smoking. He was crawling at 6 months, walking by 9 months, and speaking complete sentences by 1 year. Cowboy's wife made a cake for his first birthday and invited Orville and Esther Johnston to come to his birthday party, Esther being Rachel's aunt. And Esther walked in and she saw that bright little baby boy walking around that little shack, and she said, "He's going to go to college." And right then and there took out their checkbook and wrote Rachel a check for $500, causing Orville to nearly keel over dead. Cowboy was right there ready to catch him and lower him gently to the ground and place pennies on his eyes should it come to that. Gibby Hockett and his wife were invited to Ferris's first birthday party, but didn't attend. Gibby had seen his grandson only once by accident when he was driving by Cowboy Landon's shack one afternoon, and he looked over, and there in the little grubby yard he saw his daughter and his grandson playing in the yard. Gibby's wife would sneak over there to the Landons to see him several times a week when Gibby was at work. Esther was furious about it. She told her brother, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself. He's your own flesh and blood, your own grandchild. He did nothing to you." But Gibby Hockett was one of these men who was unmoved by such things. It is curious how the same child can be such a joy to one person and such embarrassment to another. And that's what happened. Gibby had prayed for a grandson, had always wanted a grandson, but had never been specific about the circumstances surrounding its birth, assuming God would hew to the proper order and first provide a husband and then a grandson. First a husband in a wedding at the Baptist church, and then 9, maybe 10 months later, so people wouldn't be doing the math in their head, a grandson. But God didn't do it that way, which wasn't the first time God had overlooked the proper order of conception, which Esther pointed out to him. She said, "It's a good thing Jesus wasn't born to your daughter. Would you have thrown him out too?" Well, yes, Gibby probably would have. Meanwhile, Cowboy was doing such a good job picking up bodies that Raleigh Baker promoted him and moved him inside, greeting mourners and arranging flower displays and sticking the little magnetic funeral flags on cars on the days of the funerals. Thanksgiving rolled around. Beezy Gibbs, the lawyer, who was 8 years older than Rachel and had never married, invited her to drive up to the city to see the world's largest Christmas tree on the day after Thanksgiving. She looked at him, she said, "Only if Ferris goes." And he said, "Well, of course." And so off they went, Beezy the lawyer and Rachel the mother and little Ferris up to the city, stopping for hamburgers at the Steak and Shake, and then driving downtown where they watched the mayor throw the switch and the lights come on. Beezy stood with his arm around Rachel, holding Ferris in his other arm, which Rachel decided she liked. She looked at Beezy. He wasn't the most handsome man she had ever seen, not as handsome as the Ferris wheel operator, but he was a kind man and bright and mercifully free of tattoos. After Ferris had been born, her father had said to her, "No decent man will ever want you," which she feared was true. But then here she was with Beezy, who was more than decent. But still standing there, Rachel wondered whether if the world's largest Christmas tree had been in their town, if Beezy would have put his arm around her. Maybe this was a city thing. Maybe he wouldn't want to be seen with her like this back in their town. But then along came Raleigh Baker and his wife, who had driven up to see the world's largest Christmas tree, and Beezy kept his arm around her and even introduced her to the Bakers, even though they had known her since she was a kid. Raleigh looked at Ferris and rubbed his little head. He said, "I've heard a lot about this little guy. Cowboys told me all about him." "He's a good boy," Rachel said. "Who did you say his father was?" Raleigh's wife asked. "I didn't," Rachel said, remembering why she had never cared for Raleigh Baker's wife. It was the next year when Beasy asked Rachel to marry him. This was around 1973, if I remember right. I was 12. They were married at the courthouse in Judge Maurer's office, all the churches being opposed to such liaisons. Cowboy Landon and his wife were there, and Ferris, of course, and Rachel's mother, who had told her husband Gibby that she had a doctor's appointment at the woman's doctor, and did he want to go? And he said no, as she knew he would. She slipped in the side door of the courthouse and stood up with Rachel, and Esther Johnson was there too, and Orville from the IGA. Cowboy gave her away, and Beasy's parents were there, looking not that pleased, but they were there, and you do get points for showing up. You do get points for showing up. You don't have to like it, but you do have to show up sometimes. I was there by accident. I had a newspaper route, and Judge Maurer was one of my customers. I walked in his office to lay the paper on his desk the way he liked it, and there they were. I stood in the corner and watched and thought how nice it would be to conduct weddings and make people happy. People like Beasy and Rachel, who were smiling at one another and crying. They were so happy. They never noticed me standing there, and I left just after Judge Maurer pronounced them husband and wife. Later, I would hear people around town talk about how Beasy had lost his mind, even though his mind seemed fine to me. I remembered all of this when Gibby Hockett died this past summer, and I was asked to do his funeral, even though I wasn't his pastor. But when you're a pastor in a small town, you do not get to choose your funerals. You can choose some things, but you don't get to choose your funerals. And you can't lie and say you'll be out of town, because people will see you on the day of the funeral and say, "I thought you were out of town today." And so you just have to gut it out and act like it's a big honor to conduct the funeral of someone you never really cared for in the first place. So there I was at Baker's funeral home, and in came Gibby's wife, who looked, for a funeral, curiously happy. And behind her came all her daughters and their husbands and children and grandchildren, including Rachel and Beasy and Ferris with his wife and their 2 sons. Ferris is in his mid-40s now. He had gone to college down at IU and then on to business school, and then when he graduated, opened up a car dealership and now owns an entire chain of them across the Midwest. Ferris Wheels. Perhaps you've seen them. He still lives in our town, Ferris does, and since none of the churches had a kind word to say about his mother when he was born, Ferris became a Unitarian just to annoy the Christians. And he now tithes, and he is loaded, let me tell you that, and generous. He believes in giving back. To whom much is given, much is expected. That is his theme. He believes that. He feels as if he has been given a great deal, a strong mother, a wonderful father, a bright wife, and 2 handsome sons. At least that's what people say. Actually, they're not all that handsome. I've seen them a lot. They look like their grandfather Gibby, which Ferris has never pointed out to them, but he's hoping braces and good haircuts will take care of a lot. At the funeral, I talked about Gibby and what a good produce department he ran. How the bananas were never too green or too ripe, because I couldn't talk about his many contributions to our town, or how kind he was. I couldn't say how much we'll miss him. And then I invited other people to stand and say something about Gibby if they wished, but no one did, following the adage that if you can't say something nice about someone, you shouldn't say anything at all. So it was a very quiet funeral. But sitting there in the silence in the funeral home, I thought about Gibby and about Ferris and Cowboy and Beezy, and how when life is difficult, the only thing that gets us through is compassion and love and generosity, and how some people never learn that, and some people do, and how we always know who is who.